Here's what nobody tells you about the day you make your last debt payment. For most people, it doesn't feel like the movies promised. There's no confetti. There's no wave of relief washing over you. You click submit on a payment like you have dozens of times before, and then, an hour later, you're back to thinking about what to make for dinner. The emotional turning point everyone expects usually doesn't arrive, at least not immediately. And if that's happened to you, there's nothing wrong with you. You just misunderstood what actually changes. Debt freedom isn't primarily an emotional event. It's a cash flow event. And what happens to that freed up cash flow in the weeks immediately after your last payment determines almost everything about whether this moment becomes a genuine turning point or just a slightly higher checking account balance that quietly disappears. I'm Ellie, and I make videos about the numbers behind the decisions everyone assumes are obvious, but usually aren't. If you've ever paid off a debt and wondered why you don't feel as different as you expected, or if you're approaching your last payment right now, stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to do differently than most people do. Hit subscribe if that sounds useful. Let's get into it. Here's the thesis of this entire video. The moment your last debt payment clears, a specific dollar amount, the exact size of that monthly payment, becomes available in your budget for the first time in however many years you've been paying it. Most people never deliberately decide where that specific amount goes. It just sits in the checking account alongside everything else, and within a few months, it's gone, absorbed into slightly nicer versions of things you were already doing, without a single purchase feeling like a decision. Let's make this concrete with actual numbers. Meet Tasha and Ben, both 29, both finishing off the same size student loan payment, $410 a month, in the same month as each other after years of paying it down. Same payment amount, same moment. What happens next is where their paths split completely. The month their final payment clears, both of them have an identical $410 a month that didn't exist in their budget the month before. Tasha did something specific before the final payment even happened. 2 weeks before the last payment was due, she set up an automatic transfer, $410, scheduled to move into a taxable investment account on the same day of the month her old loan payment used to be due. The freed up money never touched her regular checking account long enough to become extra spending money. It moved from one committed purpose, debt repayment, directly into another, investing, without a gap in between where it could feel unclaimed. That timing detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Money that arrives in a checking account without an immediate destination doesn't stay neutral for long. Within days, the brain starts running a quiet background process, noticing the higher balance and gradually recalibrating what feels normal to spend. This isn't a character flaw. It's the same basic mechanism that makes a hotel minibar feel different from a grocery store. Proximity and availability change behavior almost independent of actual need. A $410 gap sitting unclaimed in a checking account for even a few weeks creates exactly the kind of proximity and availability that invites gradual, barely noticed spending. Tasha's transfer closed that gap before it ever had a chance to open. Ben didn't do this. Not out of carelessness, but because it genuinely didn't occur to him that the moment required a specific decision. He'd been so focused on the finish line itself that he hadn't thought past it. The $410 simply started accumulating in his checking account every month, and it felt, understandably, like a well-earned cushion of breathing room after years of tight budgeting. Here's how that $410 actually got spent, and it's worth walking through slowly, because none of these were reckless purchases. In the first month, Ben upgraded his streaming bundle to include a couple of add-on services he'd been eyeing for a while, adding $45 a month. That felt reasonable. He'd been disciplined for years, and this was a small reward. In the second month, he noticed he'd been ordering takeout more often, not as a deliberate choice, just as a natural response to having a little more slack in his account, adding roughly $150 a month compared to his old habits. By the third month, he upgraded his phone plan to one with more data and a better device financing option, adding $90 a month, reasoning that his old plan had felt restrictive for a while and he could finally afford better. The rest, about $125 a month, dissolved into slightly more frequent small purchases. A coffee here, a subscription there, nothing individually notable, all of it compounding into a real number by the time you add it up. 45 plus 150 plus 90 plus 125, $410. The exact size of his old loan payment, fully reabsorbed within about 12 weeks, spread across 4 separate decisions that each felt small and disconnected at the time. 1 year later, here's where things stand. Tasha's automatic transfer never stopped, and she genuinely stopped thinking about it as a decision after the first couple of months. The same way the loan payment itself had once felt automatic. Over 12 months, she contributed $4,920, and with modest market growth along the way, using the same 8% assumed average annual return we've used before, a conservative estimate between the market's long-term nominal and inflation-adjusted averages, her account had grown to just over $5,100, including about $180 of actual investment growth on top of her contributions. Ben, over that same year, spent an equivalent amount, roughly $4,900, across the 4 categories that had quietly absorbed his freed-up payment. At the end of the year, he has nothing distinct to point to. Not because he wasted the money on anything shameful. Streaming, food, a phone plan, and small purchases are all completely normal things to spend money on. But those 4 things are now simply his new baseline monthly spending, not a reward he's actively enjoying so much as an invisible new floor under his budget. One that would now feel like a downgrade to walk back, even though a year ago none of it existed at all. Let's extend this out 1 more year, because the second year is where the gap becomes genuinely difficult to close. Tasha's account, still receiving $410 a month plus growth, crosses roughly $10,500 by the end of year 2. Ben's $410 a month is still fully absorbed into his now normal baseline spending. And here's the part that makes year 2 harder than year 1. Reversing any of those 4 habits now requires actively giving something up that's become familiar, rather than simply declining to add something new. In year 1, Ben never had to feel a loss. Each addition just felt like a small upgrade. By year 2, undoing any of them would feel like a downgrade, which is a psychologically much harder thing to choose to do voluntarily, even though the dollar amount involved is identical either way. This is the part that explains why Ben doesn't feel meaningfully different 2 years after paying off his debt, despite genuinely having more disposable income than before. His lifestyle simply rose to fill the exact size of the gap his old payment used to occupy. The same mechanism behind lifestyle creep at any income level, just triggered by a debt payment disappearing instead of a raise arriving. The dollar amount moved. The underlying financial position didn't. Here's why this absorption happens so smoothly that most people don't even notice it occurring. There's no single moment where anyone sits down and decides, I will now spend $410 differently. Each individual upgrade, the streaming bundle, the takeout habit, the phone plan, gets decided separately, days or weeks apart, each one small enough to feel inconsequential on its own. Nobody consciously chooses to reabsorb an entire freed-up payment. It happens through the accumulation of several unconnected, individually reasonable decisions. Exactly the same structural pattern that shows up whenever spending is allowed to simply rise to meet available cash flow without a predetermined plan. So what actually determines which path you end up on? It's not willpower, and it's not a personality difference between someone like Tasha and someone like Ben. It's whether the redirection gets decided and automated before the final payment clears or after. Tasha's transfer was already running by the time her old loan payment would have been due. Ben's $410 had no destination waiting for it, so it found several small destinations on its own. One purchase at a time, none of them planned as a group. If you're currently paying down a debt and can see the finish line coming, here's exactly what to do differently than Ben did. About 2 to 4 weeks before your final payment clears, not after, decide specifically where that exact dollar amount is going next, an investment account, a dedicated savings goal, whatever matters most to you, and set up the transfer to happen automatically on the same schedule your old payment used to follow. Match the transfer date to your old due date specifically, so the money moves at the exact moment it would have otherwise landed in your checking account with nowhere assigned to go. The goal is for the money to move directly from one committed purpose to another, without ever sitting in your checking account long enough to start feeling like unclaimed spending money. If you've already paid off a debt and the freed up payment has already been absorbed the way Ben's was, the good news is this is completely reversible. It just requires the same deliberate step. Now, that would have been easier to take earlier. And it's worth doing, even if it feels a year or two late. Start by looking at your current spending and identifying what's actually crept in since the debt cleared, not by guessing, but by comparing your bank statements from 6 months before the payoff to your statements now, category by category. Once you can name the specific additions, decide how much of that you're realistically willing to redirect starting this month, even if it's not the full original amount right away, and automate that portion the same way, so it stops depending on a decision you have to remember to make every single month. Here's what a partial redirection actually looks like in practice, using Ben's exact numbers as an example. If Ben, even 2 years in, decided he wasn't willing to give up the streaming upgrade or the better phone plan, but was willing to scale back the takeout habit and redirect the small miscellaneous purchases, that's $150 plus $125, $275 a month, redirected starting today. At the same 8% assumed return, $275 a month over just 1 year builds to roughly $3,400, including modest growth, not the full $5,100 Tasha had after her first year, but a meaningfully real number that didn't exist the day before Ben decided to act. A partial redirection started today still compounds meaningfully over time, and it's a far better outcome than waiting for a cleaner moment that never quite arrives, or holding out for the willpower to reverse all 4 habits at once, which is a much higher bar than reversing just 1 or 2 of them. Paying off debt was never really the finish line everyone expects it to be. It's the starting line for a decision most people never realize they're being asked to make. And whether you make that decision on purpose or let it get made for you, one small reasonable purchase at a time is the entire difference between a debt payment that becomes real wealth and one that simply becomes a slightly more expensive version of the exact same life. If this helped you think differently about what happens after debt freedom, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos that run the numbers nobody else bothers to run.